Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our series in Acts. And we're at the point in Acts where we're in the final two chapters. We're going to be in chapter 27 tonight. And we're going to see that we have seen over the last several weeks and last several chapters in Acts that Paul has returned to Jerusalem after the third missionary journey and has been in a series of trials or a position where he's having to defend himself because of the accusations of the Jewish religious leaders there in Jerusalem. And so up to this point, we've seen him taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea, where he stood before Felix. Felix left him confined, and ultimately Festus took over after he had been there for a couple of years. And then Festus allowed Paul to speak. And then, because he was new in office, he allowed Paul to speak before Agrippa II. And after all of Paul standing before these various leaders, it was determined that because of Paul's appeal to Caesar, he would have to be shipped from Caesarea to Rome to appear before Nero, who was the emperor. And so we've talked about that in depth, how Paul used his Roman citizenship essentially to escape being released by Festus into the hands of the Jewish authorities and allowing them to try him on their terms, knowing how that would have went, because it was clearly stated that they desired to end his life, as they had attempted to do at the Temple Mount complex. And so, last chapter, we seen his final speech before Agrippa II. Obviously, Festus was there as well. And what we're going to see here in chapter 27 is basically Paul's trip, his voyage by sea from Caesarea to Rome. We'll see that next week in chapter 28. But we're going to cover all of chapter 27. And this is one of those parts of Scripture that, honestly, if you're not reading this and looking at a map, it's really not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. And so what I'm going to try to do tonight is utilize one of the features of this particular Logos map set that I have and show you kind of what I do in my studies to try to bring it to life. Because honestly, if you just read through this chapter and the next and you don't try to identify or place yourself there with Paul and others, it can be kind of mundane and kind of boring. But I'm going to show you some of the things that I do in my personal studies to kind of liven it up and make it more experiential. And so let's jump into chapter 27. We're going to read from the NET, so that'll be to your far right screen because it reads a little better. And there's a lot of nautical terminology here, some of which we'll discuss, and some of which I was not familiar with because there's not a whole lot of sea voyages that are as descriptive as what we see here in chapter 27. And so, with that said, let's jump into verse 1. When it was decided we should sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Who would we be? Luke. We'll see that Aristarchus is also part of this traveling company who is from Macedonia. And what's interesting about that, and we'll see that in a few verses where that's mentioned, is that in other Pauline writings, he mentions from Rome that Luke and Aristarchus is with him in Colossians and Philemon. So we see the historical accuracy of this account that Luke is giving, and we're going to see a very, very detailed, somewhat, you could say, overly detailed account, considering how sparse the details are in other stories that we've seen in Acts. And the obvious reason why is because he's there. He's a part of this journey. This would be a dramatic experience that Luke himself was right there with Paul during. And so he includes the details. And one of the things that he's trying to do in the inclusion of this story and spending so much time detailing and basically taking us step by step through this sea voyage is to show God's hand in the advancing of the gospel and how that God would fulfill his promise that he made to Paul, that he will make it to Rome, that he will reach Rome with the gospel, with the good news, and ultimately he will stand before the emperor and speak about Christ. And so it's showing us, as we've seen unfold throughout this story here in Acts, where this gospel and this Christian movement began in Jerusalem. And it slowly but surely, against all odds, and even in the face of, or you could say being propelled by persecution, as we've seen in the early church in Jerusalem, the gospel, because of that, began to spread and began to take its outreach beyond the land of Israel into the rest of the known world, in particular in the Roman Empire. And so we're going to see the story conclude in Rome, which is the epicenter of the Roman Empire. And so you have Luke, who is telling this from a first-person perspective, and he's telling us that Paul and other prisoners, doesn't exactly tell us how many prisoners there were. It will give us a number of how many are on the last ship that they're on, as we'll see. But Paul is among other prisoners that are being taken to Rome. Now, here's the difference between Paul and the other prisoners. The other prisoners are most likely not Roman citizens, and they are being sent to Rome because they have already been found to be guilty, and they would be sent to Rome to be made a sport for the Roman audiences there in Rome. Something you need to understand about the Roman civilization is very cruel. Death was no big deal. They viewed the lives of other human beings as something that they could find pleasure in seeing other people's death. Convicted felons oftentimes were taken into these coliseums just like the Christians were, and fed to lions, torn apart by chariots, and tortured in various ways. And it was seen as a sport in their society. And so many of these prisoners that would be going there with Paul were already guilty and had likely committed pretty severe crimes to be given this sentence. And so verse 2 says, "We went on board a ship from Adramyttium." And if we look at the map here, we can zone out. We can see that the ship would be from up here. And likely what you have here in this ship is it's a smaller ship that would have just traveled around this coastline right here, all along this coast. And so they board that ship that is from that location, and we're going to see that they'll pick up a larger ship as they travel on. It says that particular ship was about to sail to various ports along the coast of the province of Asia, which is modern-day Turkey, Western Turkey, and put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day, we put in at Sidon. You can follow on the map if you want to look. So they would travel, it's about 70 miles from Caesarea to Sidon. And Julius, treating Paul kindly, Julius is the centurion, allowed him to go to his friends so they could provide him with what he needed. Here's something you need to understand about this sea voyage. These ships would primarily be cargo ships. Ships that would be carrying cargo or grain or various other important trade commodities. And then they would obviously have opportunities to haul travelers, or in this case, Roman soldiers who are company prisoners, as well as other people. And so when they get to Sidon, because Paul has this privileged status of being a Roman citizen, the centurion allows him to go to the local Christians that would be there and get things that he would need for the travel. And here's how travel worked under these circumstances. Any of these cargo ships would pretty much have to allow centurions or Roman officials of the status of a centurion and their prisoners to board the ship and travel with them. Okay, they pretty much had to do that by Roman rule and law, but they didn't have to provide for them. And so what they would have to do is carry their own provisions, their own clothing and food and necessities for the duration of the travel. And so that's what we see Paul here doing, is getting needs and from the local Christian community there at Sidon. And so it says, as we continue reading, it says, "From there we put out to sea and sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us." When you see that terminology, against the lee, it's basically the side that would block the wind. Okay? We're going to see that they're traveling in the fall, in the early fall into middle fall. And so the winds are starting to shift and change. They're almost to the season where it's too dangerous to travel. And we're going to see that ends up getting them in trouble because of the time that they're traveling. But that's what that means to have the lee side to the ship. And so they sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Now, where have we learned about Cyprus? First missionary journey, right? Who went there? Barnabas and Paul. And who went there on the second missionary journey? Pop quiz. Who? Barnabas and John Mark. Remember? Because Paul and Barnabas were going to go, and Barnabas wanted to take, his relative, John Mark, who abandoned them on the first missionary journey, and Paul said, "Me genoito," right? "Ma pitom," no way. And so they went their separate ways, and Paul took who? Silas. Y'all are getting this, right? Repetition. That's where the stick factor comes, and it's retained. Okay? So verse 5. "After we had sailed across the open sea off Cilicia and Pamphylia," which is the regions here. Notice how they're traveling near the shoreline. It says, "We put in at Myra and Lucia," which is right here. And I don't know why this doesn't track them pretty much stopping right here, but that's what we're going to see. Verse 6, "There the centurion found a ship from Alexandria sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it." Now, here's where they would have upgraded in the size of their ship. Now, let's scroll out here because here's Alexandria, Egypt, which is the second largest city in the Roman Empire during that time. And because of the fertile land in Egypt, because of the flooding and the agriculture there, Egypt produced and sent out on cargo ships a lot of grain, in particular a lot of wheat. And so this ship that they find here at Myra would be a ship that came from Alexandria hauling wheat and obviously other cargo as well. And it's estimated that this ship would have been as large as 150, 180 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 40 feet in depth, just to kind of give you a visual of the size of this vessel that they're about to embark with. Okay? And so they get on this ship from Alexandria sailing for Italy, and they board it. And verse 7 says, we sailed slowly for many days and arrived with difficulty off Sindus, which is right up here. Sindus would have had 2 ports, and they sailed by it. Because the wind prevented us from going any further, we sailed under the lee of Crete. So the wind's obviously shifting because they went on the north side of Cyprus, but here they're wanting to get under the lee side on the south side of Crete. And so they're having to deal with winds that are beginning to change. The seasons are changing. And so that's going to become a growing problem in this narrative, as we'll see. So they are sailing slowly, and they sail under the lee of Crete off Salmone. With difficulty, we sailed along the coast of Crete and came to a place called Fair Havens that was near the town of Lasea. So I'm going to move the map here, and this is where we are at this point. Now I'm going to show you a feature that I mentioned earlier in Logos. In this particular map, you'll notice that if I put my mouse right here and then move it real quick, it has the geographic pinpoints on Google Maps. I can click on this, and it will open a browser for me to that location. And one thing that I like to do is I like to close that for one thing. I like to go to the satellite imagery. And then I like to zone out and kind of look at the topography. So they've traveled around this side, around the southern part, and the port that they would have been at would be right here in this elbow of the island of Crete. Pretty massive island, by the way. And so they're right here. And if you'll notice, we'll zone in. If they're right here in this harbor, right here, you can't really tell unless you really zone in, but right here is a mountain called Mount Ida, which is I want to think it's like 3,000 or so feet high, which would have blocked their view to the north and east, and would have blocked a lot of wind as well too. And so they're there at Fair Havens at the port. Let's go back to our text. We'll return to the map as we go along. So they come to Fairhaven, and that's where they're at. Verse 9 says, since considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because the fast was already over. What is the fast? In Judaism, what day is known as the Great Fast? The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It's a large, there are other fast days in Judaism, but if there is one feast in particular that's called the fast day, it is the Day of Atonement. And so, why is it important to know that? Because we know when the Feast of Atonement is, the Day of Atonement is, and it is always when? On our calendar, it can fluctuate between September and October, but based on looking at the chronology in Acts, the most likely timing of this voyage is in the year 59 AD, and the feast would have fallen in the beginning. October 5th would have been Yom Kippur. And so we know we're at least on the other side of that. So we're into at least the middle of October, and obviously working towards winter, which is extremely, extremely dangerous time to be sailing there in that area. Okay? So the voyage was dangerous because the fast was already over, and Paul advised them. Now, this is something we need to understand, because Paul is not speaking like he's heard from the Lord here. Paul is an experienced traveler, as he has traveled by sea on many occasions at this point in his life. And he's just going to try to give them some sound, logical traveling advice. This is not Paul claiming to be hearing from the Lord in this advice he gives. This is him just speaking as a human being that has done a lot of travel on the sea and knows that things could get extremely dangerous, because when they leave this island, there's a lot of ocean, there's a lot of sea in front of them that could potentially prove to be fatal. Okay, so Paul advised them, men, I can see the voyage is going to end in disaster and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So Paul's not feeling real good about this journey, is he? He is believing that they don't need to go anywhere, right? That they need to winter there at Fair Havens and kind of wait this thing out. But verse 11, but the centurion was more convinced by the captain and the ship's owner than by what Paul said. Because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there. Now, why would the ship owner and the captain kind of be more motivated? Let's get this cargo to Rome. Money, right? Because you don't get paid until you get there with the cargo. And here's something that we know under the previous Emperor Claudius. They actually made provision for cargo ships that would dare to travel during this dangerous time of the year, that if they would go ahead and travel and bring the much needed wheat or grain to Rome, that if there was loss of the ship, they would take care of the financial loss. And so that would motivate some of these ship owners and lead captains and sailors of these ships to say, let's do it. Why not risk it? Because you kind of have an insurance policy from the man with the most power in the entire empire. And obviously he would have had the funds to back up what he said he would do. And so they're more willing to take a risk than a lot of people because of the financial gain and motivation there. But so they put out to sea from there. They hoped that somehow they could reach Phoenix. And you can look at the map here and see that it's not too far, about 40 miles or so from Fair Havens. And that's where they had hoped to reach, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So you have to ask, what's the difference in 30 some more miles if you're going to spend the winter on the island? And the narrative told us the reason, because they did not think that the port of Fair Havens was suitable enough to spend the entire winter. And so they chose to move on to Phoenix and hopefully dock there for the winter. When a gentle south wind sprang up, a deceiving south wind, as we'll see, they thought they could carry out their purpose. So they weighed anchor and sailed close along the coast of Crete. Not long after this, a hurricane force wind called the northeaster blew down from the island. And they obviously didn't expect this, right? You can see that they're headed towards Phoenix, but suddenly this northeastern wind, violent. This, when you study and read about sea travels in this time, this was the most dreaded wind possible. It's primarily a northeastern wind that we see here is literally a typhoon type of wind. Okay, verse 15. I'm going to scroll up to the top. When the ship was caught in it and could not head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. So they're just going wherever the wind takes them. And you can see that's why they don't end up going to Phoenix, to port, because this wind hits them once they get out of this elbow here and head this way. The wind catches them and it drives them southward because it's a strong wind coming from the north. And you have to understand, this cargo ship would likely be transporting probably 250 to as much as 500 tons of grain alone. That doesn't count the passengers and the other cargo that's on the ship and the weight of the ship itself. And so this is extremely dangerous conditions for them to be out in the middle of the sea. So let's continue to read. Verse 16. And as we ran under the lee of a small island called Cauda, you can see it here. It's a little bitty island. Not much of a lee, right? We were able with difficulty to get the ship's boat under control. What does it mean, get the ship's boat under control? What is the ship's boat? How many of you have seen the movie Titanic? Right? You see when the ship starts to sink, what do they start doing? They start lowering down these little boats off the side of the ship. All of these large cargo ships would have had these small boats that, or at least one, that would be affixed to it in some way by ropes where they could easily lower it down if need be into the water. Well, obviously when they get in this violent typhoon wind, the boat is rocking, and this boat that's hanging over the side is going to what? Take on water. So it's full of water. It's being beat to death on the side of the boat. And so what they want to do is get that boat, in case they need it, back to a place where it's not going to be destroyed. Okay? And so just place yourself in the boat, and you get seasick right away. Right? So that would be enough right there. Just, ugh. Anyway, so they did. After the crew had hoisted it aboard, so they have to pull it plumb aboard, they use supports, which would be ropes or cables that they pull across and through the ship and underneath the ship to stabilize it and strengthen it, because obviously ships were different back then than they are today. And so you always had the risk when you're being driven with the wind of being driven into something that would catch the bottom and bust it open. And so they're trying to support it. And then you have the tossing of the ship, which would make it want to what? Come apart, right? And so they're trying to reinforce it and strengthen it as much as they can as they're being driven with this wind. Says, after verse 17, after the crew had hoisted aboard, they used supports to undergird the ship, fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor, thus letting themselves to be driven along. So I'm going to zone out here, and what they feared is, you can see right here is the Syrtis Major. They feared, because of the violence of this storm, that they were going to be driven into this area right here, which was known to have shallow places that would undoubtedly destroy the bottom of this boat and leave them stranded miles and miles and miles from shore. And again, because of the time of the year, the changing temperature, potential hypothermia, I mean, there's a lot of things that are staring them in the face that are challenging their existence at this place in this voyage. And so, let's see, where are we at? Fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor, thus letting themselves be driven along. And I think driven along there is like a mile and a half per hour, just being beat to pieces. So, verse 18. The next day, because we were violently battered by the storm, they began throwing the cargo overboard, which tells us what? they're not too optimistic about making it to land. Because the only time that they would be willing to throw precious cargo overboard is when their lives are obviously viewed to be in great danger. Now, we know that there's 270 plus people aboard this boat, and at some point, some of them might be like, we're throwing some cargo off, whether you want us to or not. And that possibly could have been the case. But either way, they threw cargo overboard. Verse 19, and on the third day they threw the ship's gear. This would be extra gear, extra sails and things of that nature that take up space and weight, and they chunk it overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and a violent storm continued to batter us, we finally abandoned all hope of being saved. I can't imagine being someone who gets like motion sickness. I cannot imagine being many days on a ship in a violent storm that is rocking violently back and forth. Can anyone identify? Can you imagine that? Not to mention it's cold, it's rainy. No thanks, right? Verse 21, since many of them had no desire to eat. I wonder why. Because they were sick as dogs and working like crazy just to keep the ship from wrecking totally. It says, since many of them had no desire to eat, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me. Great time to point that out, Paul. Right? While all hope is lost, and Paul stands up, you should have listened to me, guys. And not put out to sea from Crete, thus avoiding this damage and loss. And now I advise you to keep up your courage. Now he's going to throw in some optimism here. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship will be lost. And here he is speaking as someone who has heard from the Lord, as we'll see. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve came to me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and God has graciously granted you the safety of all who are sailing with you. How comforting would that be in the midst of all this? You have to wonder how many of them thought, okay, Paul, right? But what we see here is God reaffirming the promise that's already been made to Paul that he will make it to Rome, being more specific that he will stand before Caesar himself. And so he spreads the word to these men. And he says, therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be just as I have been told. And then he says, but we must run aground on some island. So Paul knows that there's going to be shipwreck. And we know from Paul's own writings, this isn't the only shipwreck that he's been a part of. So unfortunately, he has experience in something nobody wants experience at, and that is being shipwrecked. He says, a night and a day I've spent in the deep. So he knows they're going to wreck, essentially. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, this is since they left the port. Can you imagine 14 nights following this path here? 14 nights. Just all the time. While we were driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected they were approaching some land. They took soundings. What is a sounding? They actually have discovered some of these in the ocean floor in recent years. They were large lead weights that on the bottom they had a large hollowed out spot that they would fill with wax. And they would lower them down, and if the lead weight hit the bottom, you would have fixed to the wax part of the ocean shore, and they would know that they hit the bottom. Plus, they could feel it. And so, why are they doing this? Because of the size of the ship and the weight of the ship, much of the ship would be below the water's surface. They were concerned about hitting objects, reefs, or land of some sort, and damaging the boat. And so they feel that they are approaching land, and they do these soundings. And they found the water was 20 fathoms deep. When they had sailed a little further, they took soundings again and found it was 15 fathoms deep. You can see here, this is one of the advantages of this NET Bible, especially if you have it in a software like Logos, where you can just look at the hyperlink and see that a fathom is about 6 feet or just under 2 meters. And so this was a nautical term for measuring the depth of water. Here it was about 120 feet at 20 fathoms. That's pretty deep if you ask me. Yep. When they had sailed a little further, they took soundings again and found it was 15 fathoms deep. So that would tell them what? They are approaching land. Because they were afraid we would run aground on the rocky coast, they threw out 4 anchors from the stern. What is the stern? You sure? It's the rear. 4 anchors from the stern, and wished for the day to appear. And literally, they prayed to God for day to come. Verse 30. When the sailors tried to escape from the ship and were lowering the ship's boat into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow, which is the front or bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So, do you see what's happening here? They're worried they're going to wreck. And the sailors, the people who are navigating this thing, go to the front of the ship, and they act like they're putting anchors at the front of the ship too. But what they're really doing is lowering that little boat that they saved earlier, and they're going to leave. They're going to leave this cargo ship because they know that they're close to land. They feel like if we can get on this little boat, we can get out of here and be safe because that big boat's going to wreck. And obviously Paul sniffs it out, and he tells the Roman centurion and soldiers that you need to stop them in order for this to go as planned. And so what do? They cut the ropes of the ship's boat and let it drift away. Verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day you have been in suspense and have gone without food. Guys, the human body can endure a lot more than we think. Can you imagine being 14 days tossed back and forth, not eating anything because you're too sick, exerting the amount of energy under that amount of stress, fearing for your life? Can you imagine how weak they would be? And Paul's like, Paul, I think he knows we're about to wreck and we're going to need to swim. And we're all weak because we ain't eating nothing because we're too sick. So he says, therefore I urge you to take some food, for this is important for your survival. For not one of you will lose a hair from his head, which is a euphemism for you won't be harmed at all. You'll be safe. Verse 35, after he said this, Paul took bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all and broke it what's interesting here, and it's been pointed out by scholars, is the phrasing here. It is literally the phrasing that you'll see in the Last Supper and the Eucharistic meal, where they take it, break it, and distribute it. And so you have an allusion here to the Eucharist, although obviously he's not taking the Eucharist with a bunch of non-believers. But he does give thanks to God in front of them all. In verse 36, so all of them were encouraged and took food themselves. We were in all 276 persons on the ship. So again, this tells you the size of the ship. It was a very large ship. When they had eaten enough to be satisfied, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. Why would they do that again? To bring it up higher, so there's less chance of them wrecking further out in the ocean, so that they can hopefully swim to the sea. There was so much cargo packed on a ship of this size, it would take anywhere from 6 to 12 days to unload all of the cargo off of a ship this size. Which explains why there's still cargo left, because they've already unloaded some. So this is their last attempt. Okay, we've ate the last meal, right? The Last Supper. And so they throw the rest of the stuff off of the ship, because at this point they're just hoping to make shore somewhere. Okay? And so it says, when day came, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. And that we'll see that this is on the island of Malta. And here again, this is where looking at the visual image will kind of help you understand what they're seeing. So we're right here. I'm going to go to Google. We're going to pull up a map and satellite imagery. We're going to zone in here, and we're going to see that they actually have named to this day St. Paul's Bay. And the bay that they would have seen, let me scroll out and we'll kind of zone in. They're coming towards this island. They would have seen this bay right here. And you can see that you have around the island underwater here, obviously what we're going to see they wreck into. Okay? But even then it's within distance they can swim to shore, as we'll see. Okay? So again, this is one of the benefits of kind of just going with them on this voyage and not just reading about places that you don't even know where these places are, and kind of visualizing what he experienced. I mean, like, what a way to end Acts. I mean, after everything that we've read that Paul's been through, hey, might as well wreck in the sea, right? Okay. Verse 40. So they slipped the anchors. They just cut the anchors off because they're not going to need them again. And left them in the sea, at the same time loosing the linkage that bound the steering oars together. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and steered toward the beach. Right? Raise the sail and let the wind take her and drive her into the shallow waters and hope for the best. And so verse 41 says, but they encountered a patch of cross currents and ran the ship aground. The bow stuck fast and could not be moved. So what happened? They're coming towards the shore. Let's see. They're coming towards this shore, this bay here. And somewhere the front of it gets stuck, right? It's stuck. And the rear of it is still taking a pounding. And so as the front of it's stuck and the waves are hitting the end, this ship's already battered and likely already leaking at this point, no doubt, which is why they're not very hopeful in this situation. And the waves continue to just bash this boat, and it's starting to come apart, as we'll see. The stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. In verse 42, now the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would escape by swimming away. But the centurion, who would be the guy in charge of the soldiers under his authority, wanting to save Paul's life, prevented them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to follow, some on planks and some on pieces of the ship. And in this way, all were brought safely to land. So can you imagine the likelihood of 14 days of intense battering, that at the end, as Paul said, by being spoken to by the angel sent by the Lord, that all of them would survive after all of this trauma, this wreckage, and they would have the energy to either swim or float on pieces of the ship that is broken up to shore, and all of them make it. Something that's probably worth pointing out is the fact that some of them obviously floated on planks or pieces of the ship. If the soldiers were to make it to shore, they would have had to do so, because they would have had armory, and they would have had weapons, their swords, which is a lot of weight, especially with them already being seasick and tired. And so for them to be able to maintain their weapons, they would have had to have floated on something to aid them, because there's no way they could have swum with all of that on and carrying the weapons, the swords and stuff. So nonetheless, just like Paul said, they all reached safely to the shore, and that's where we're going to stop for tonight. Any questions? Amber?
So in the beginning when it says we, and you're saying that Luke and Aristarchus are with them, was that normal? Were they prisoners, or were they, like, is it normal for a prisoner to take guests?
When you have a prisoner of Paul's status who's a Roman citizen who is yet to be formally indicted or convicted, you don't even have a legitimate charge at this point, right? That's the purpose of him going to stand before Caesar. And they would have allowed him to have a little bit more liberty than a normal prisoner. We already seen earlier that he was allowed to have his friends come and go and bring him provision when he was incarcerated. So it said at the outset that he had favor with the centurion, so he gave him liberty. And so this is part of that liberty that he was given as a Roman citizen that was not yet formally convicted of a certain crime. So he had that liberty to have them with him. Okay? Another?
Yeah, another one. On the bread, when he blessed it and broke bread and they all ate, it's a big ship, so they would have had enough. Would they have had enough bread, or would this be like a multiplying of the bread to feed 276?
They would have had plenty of supply, given that this was a cargo ship and it was hauling grain. So I don't see this as a miracle like we see in the Gospels. There are some that want to read the Eucharist into it because it uses the exact terminology and the same terminology that you see when Jesus fed the multitudes. But I don't see enough evidence to assume it was a miracle, because on any given occasion, similar situation, they would have had plenty of sustenance to go around. Peggy?
The ship was made out of wood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, would they have had, because like they had sails, but also most of the time on those big ships, they would have had slaves that would row, am I correct?
Most likely, yeah. Yeah, they would have hired hands, and then they would have a captain with a crew of seasoned sailors who would all perform various tasks on the ship, and it's very likely that there would have been slaves as well to do some of the rowing and things of that nature.
And the wheat, if it was taken on water, man, that wheat would have got really heavy.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can't imagine what it was like being 14 days straight of being just seasick. Ugh. Any others? Doug?
Thinking ahead a little bit, think, well, this is from all the shipwreck. He's fixing to get snake bit, right?
We'll see that next week.
The question is this: if it's all that cold and all that bad, what's this snake still doing out?
We'll talk about that next week.
It's the Mediterranean, it's not backwards.
It's the wind that's cold more than anything in this instance. But Shane?
The theophany that's spoken of, the Greek word is angelos, right? Is that similar to the malach
Yeah, it's the
we
Greek.
in the Old Testament?
Yep.
Are there many occurrences other than like the Damascus Road experience, the prison experience for earlier in Acts? Like is this one of the last theophany experiences you
Um,
know of?
let's just look. Let's see. Okay, we see that it's the Greek word angelos. You can click on the wheel here and see. I don't know if you could see as I was scrolling through so quickly, but you can see it appear quite a bit in Acts. Part of it is in some of the speeches that they mention angels in it, but that word is very common. It's not restricted to being a divine being. That particular word angelos means messenger. Most of the times it is a divine being, a divine messenger, but not always. But we see that is the last time it's mentioned in the Acts narrative for sure. And after that, far as historical theophanies, we know that Revelation would be mid-90s, which is a lot later.
Was that a revelation? Was that a vision though, and not just like a? Because this one said he stood before me. So
That's a good question. I would have to scan through it and see if this is the last dated experience of this kind. Because I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be dated later than this occasion for sure. Any other questions? I was thinking of some things funny, but I'll keep them to myself. All right.